Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Officially, Ivan Milat murdered 7 people. But when police entered Belanglo State Forest in 1992, they uncovered something that immediately suggested the possibility of additional victims and an even wider history of disappearances. The forest was hiding secrets. Bodies were discovered among the trees. Some had been concealed for years, and many showed evidence of extreme violence. What police had uncovered was not simply a crime scene, it was a graveyard. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The person responsible was not hiding in the forest. He was somewhere outside, living an ordinary life. And investigators had no idea who he was. Belanglo State Forest stretches across thousands of hectares southwest of Sydney. Endless rows of pine trees stand in unnatural formation, their trunks rising like pillars into a canopy that blocks much of the sunlight. Even during the day, parts of Belanglo feel isolated, silent. The air carries the smell of pine and damp earth. Fallen needles cover the ground, hiding whatever may lie beneath. It's the kind of place where someone can disappear. And for years, people had. In September 1992, a man searching through the forest noticed something unusual near a group of trees. At first, it appeared insignificant, a piece of clothing. Maybe some rubbish left behind by campers. But something felt wrong, and as he moved closer, the shape beneath the fabric became clear. Human remains. Police were called immediately. Within hours, detectives, forensic specialists, and search teams arrived, and the area was sealed. What investigators initially believed might be a single homicide quickly became something much larger. As search teams moved deeper into the forest, more discoveries were made. Then another, and another. Bodies hidden throughout Belanglo, some only metres apart. Others are separated by dense bushland. Some had been there for years, exposed to the weather, animals, and time. What started as a small search soon became one of the biggest murder investigations Australia had ever seen. This was not one murder. It wasn't even 2. Someone had been bringing victims into Belanglo State Forest. Someone had been killing them. And someone had been returning to conceal what had happened. But somewhere beyond the trees, the person responsible was still free. December 1989. The decade is ending. Across Australia, thousands of young people are travelling the country. Backpacking across Australia was common for young travellers, and hitchhiking was often seen as a normal way to get around. Accepting a lift from a stranger is simply part of the adventure. 19-year-old Deborah Everist and 20-year-old James Gibson were among them. Deborah was from Melbourne. She was described as adventurous and independent, with a love for travelling and exploring new places. James was also from Victoria. He was known as easygoing and friendly, someone who enjoyed meeting new people. The pair were travelling towards a festival near Albury, and like many young people their age, they were exploring the world, making memories and imagining what came next. On December 30th, 1989, Deborah and James left Sydney, intending to travel south toward Victoria. Nothing about the journey appeared unusual. There were no warning signs, no indication that anything was wrong. Then they disappeared. At first, their absence didn't immediately raise an alarm. Travellers change plans. People miss calls. Trips can sometimes take longer than expected. But as the days passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. The calls never came. The updates stopped. And the day they were expected home came and went, but they never arrived. Their families began searching for answers. Hostels were contacted, friends were called, police reports were filed. But investigators found nothing. No confirmed sightings, no bank activity, no explanation. It was as if Deborah and James had vanished. Their case became another missing persons investigation, another file, another family waiting for answers. Nobody knew it at the time, but Deborah Everist and James Gibson would later become two of the victims in one of Australia's most notorious serial murder cases. And somewhere, the person responsible was still free. January 25th, 1990. Less than a month after Deborah and James disappear, another traveller begins a journey that will nearly end in murder. 24-year-old British backpacker Paul Onions is travelling through New South Wales. Like thousands of other travellers, he's relying on hitchhiking to get from place to place. A vehicle pulls over. There's nothing about the driver that raises suspicion. He appears like any other person offering a lift. He introduces himself as Bill, and Paul accepts the lift. And for a while, everything appears normal. The two men talk. They discuss travel, work, and life in Australia. But gradually, the conversation changes. The longer they drive, the more uncomfortable Paul becomes. What starts as small talk begins to turn towards weapons, violence, and survival. A feeling begins to grow that something is wrong. And then Bill leaves the main road. They turn off into an isolated road. The world around them falls away. No traffic, no houses, no help nearby. Bill eventually stops, and in that moment, Paul realises he is no longer simply a passenger. According to Paul's account, the driver produced a firearm and he saw rope. He claimed it was a robbery. It becomes clear what is happening. Paul is in danger. And he reacts immediately, escaping from the vehicle and running as fast as he can back to the highway. Behind him, the armed man gives chase. Paul reaches the roadside and desperately signals drivers passing by. Then he stands directly in front of the next car speeding toward him. Joanne Berry is driving towards him. She has no choice but to stop. Paul gets into her car and escapes. The gunman leaves and Paul is able to get away safely. He is taken to the police and gives a detailed statement. He describes Bill. He describes the vehicle. But at the time, the significance was not yet understood. The report becomes another file, another investigation, another unanswered question. Years later, detectives would realise Paul Onions may have been the only person to have been targeted by Ivan Milat and survive. As months pass, more travellers vanish. At first, the cases appear unrelated. Australia is a large country. People disappear for all kinds of reasons, not all of them suspicious. Some leave, some change plans, some just lose contact. But slowly, a pattern begins to emerge. "21-year-old German backpacker Simone Schmidl is travelling through Australia. She is intelligent, adventurous, and eager to experience the world. She keeps in regular contact with her family through letters, phone calls, and updates about her journey. In January 1991, she travelled towards the New South Wales and Victorian border. After this, contact stops. As her family's attempts to reach her fail, concerns grow into fear. She never arrives at her destination, and no one hears from her again. December 1991. 2 more travellers disappear. 21-year-old Gabor Neugebauer and 20-year-old Anja Habschied are travelling together. They were nearing the end of their Australian trip, with plans waiting for them back home. They were last seen leaving Sydney, and then they vanished. No calls, no letters, no explanation. They vanish without a trace. April 1992. 2 British backpackers disappear. Joanne Walters was 22. Caroline Clarke was 21. They had met while travelling, and they were last seen heading south from Sydney. And once again, contact stops. They were never seen again. At this stage, police do not officially connect the disappearances. Different victims, different investigators, different files. But looking back, similarities begin to stand out. They were all young travellers, hitchhiking on major highways, travelling south in New South Wales. A pattern is beginning to emerge. Someone is targeting vulnerable travellers. Someone is gaining their trust. And someone is isolating them. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying these deeper case breakdowns, there's a full extended membership version available through the website. That's where I go beyond the main narrative into structure, timelines, decision points, and the investigative layers that don't always make it into the public cut. It's all linked in the description if you want to go deeper. All right, let's get back into it. For years, nobody notices the connection, and the killer remains free. September 1992, Belanglo State Forest becomes the centre of a major police investigation. The first discovery changes everything. What begins as a search for answers about one missing person quickly expands into something far larger. Search teams move throughout the forest. Another body is found, and another. It's clear that it's no longer one case. It's multiple connected murders. The bodies are spread across the forest, but a pattern begins to emerge. The victims had been brought into an isolated area, their bodies concealed, and attempts made to hide the evidence. As investigators identify the remains, missing persons cases begin to connect, and 7 names emerge. Deborah Everist, James Gibson, Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, Anja Habschied, Joanne Walters, Clarke. For their families, years of uncertainty has come to an end, but the answers bring devastating grief. The missing backpackers had been murdered, and now one question remained. Who was responsible? From the crime scenes at Belanglo State Forest, investigators could see that the offender had complete control over the victims. The victims were not killed in a single consistent way. Different methods were used, including stabbing and shooting. Some victims had been restrained. In some cases, forensic evidence suggested sexual interference, although findings were not consistent across all victims. But the evidence pointed to a clear pattern of control, isolation, and concealment. Simone Schmidl was stabbed at least 8 times, with injuries including wounds to the chest and spinal area. Gabor Neugebauer was restrained and shot 6 times to the back of the head. Anja Habschied was also found bound and suffered fatal injuries, including decapitation. Joanne Walters was stabbed around 14 to 15 times, suffering multiple wounds to the chest and back. Clarke was shot around 10 times to the head. Their deaths reflected the same pattern of violence and concealment. Deborah and James both suffered severe blunt force trauma and at least 1 confirmed stab wound, though the exact number of stab injuries has not been consistently documented in forensic summaries. Their remains were discovered during later searches of the forest. The forensic evidence changed the investigation. Detectives were now looking at a single offender, someone familiar with remote areas, someone comfortable approaching strangers, someone who is able to gain trust. The victims had something in common. They were young, they were travelling, and they relied on strangers for transport. The killer didn't need to force victims into a vehicle. He just needed them to believe he was safe. That understanding changed everything. Police weren't searching for a random attacker anymore. They were searching for someone who looked completely ordinary. After the discovery of the bodies at Belanglo State Forest, detectives began building a profile of the person they were searching for. The offender was familiar with remote areas. He understood the roads. He was comfortable approaching strangers, and most importantly, he was able to convince vulnerable travellers to trust him. The question was, who had the ability to do this? The investigation became one of Australia's largest homicide investigations. A special task force was created, Task Force Air. Hundreds of investigators began examining every possible connection. Missing persons reports, witness statements, vehicles, firearms, travel routes, and anyone who had contact with the victims. Slowly, a suspect began to emerge. One name began to appear consistently: Ivan Robert Marco Milat. Ivan Milat was born on the 27th of December 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales. He grew up in a large family of Croatian immigrants. The Milat family lived near the Picton area of New South Wales, close to the roads and bushland surrounding Belanglo State Forest. Long before investigators connected him to the backpacker murders, Milat had a criminal history. As a young man, he was involved in offences including theft, break and enter, and other serious crimes. He had also been investigated over allegations involving sexual violence. The police already knew his name, but knowing someone's history and proving they are responsible for multiple murders are two very different things. Now, detectives needed evidence. As investigators looked deeper into Milat's background, they began hearing a very different description of the same man. To some, he seemed friendly and talkative, the kind of person who could easily start a conversation with a stranger and to appear to be helpful. That description matched the type of person investigators believed the killer needed to be. Someone that travellers would feel comfortable accepting a lift from. But others described a very different side. A man with a temper. A man with a violent side. A man whose behaviour could change very quickly. Investigators began asking whether the friendly personality was simply a way of gaining trust. For years, Paul Onion's encounter with the armed driver remained a separate investigation, a terrifying incident on a highway. A stranger with a gun, a lucky escape. But everything changed when investigators began connecting the Belanglo murders. At the time, Paul had provided police with a detailed description of the man who attacked him, the vehicle, the weapon, the terrifying incident. And then thousands of kilometres away in England, Paul saw news reports about the Belanglo murders. The news reports showed a photograph of a suspect. Paul recognised the face immediately. The man he had barely escaped from. The man who had pointed a gun at him. The man who had tried to stop him from leaving. Ivan Milat. He contacted the authorities and provided his identification to investigators. For investigators, this was a huge turning point. They now had something incredibly valuable, a living witness, someone who had encountered the suspected offender and survived. Paul's account provided detectives with a direct link between Ivan Milat and the pattern they had been investigating. But the case against Milat was not built on one piece of evidence. It was built piece by piece. Witness accounts, forensic evidence, vehicle records, firearms, possessions, and links between Milat and the victims. Investigators began investigating Milat's movements, his vehicles, his employment history, his knowledge of the area around Belanglo. They searched multiple properties that were connected to the Milat family, and what they found would become crucial to the prosecution's case. Among the items recovered were items that belonged to the missing backpackers: camping equipment, clothing, personal belongings, travel items, objects that had once belonged to people whose families had spent years searching for answers. Items that Ivan Milat had given to members of his family. For investigators, these discoveries transformed the case. The evidence suggested that Milat was connected to the victims. Now detectives had to prove it. By 1994, investigators believed that they had enough evidence to move against Ivan Milat. The investigation had taken almost 2 years. Thousands of interviews had been conducted. Evidence had been collected. Witness statements had been reviewed, and the case had become one of the most significant criminal investigations in Australian history. On the 22nd of May 1994, police moved in. The arrest operation was carefully planned. Investigators knew Milat had access to firearms, and they knew he had a history of violence. They knew the importance of securing further evidence. Milat was arrested at his home in Eagle Vale. The man investigators believed was responsible for 7 murders was finally in custody. But the investigation wasn't over. The arrest was only the beginning. Now, prosecutors had to prove what detectives believed. Ivan Milat was the man responsible for the deaths of 7 young travellers. The trial would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Australian history. The prosecution presented a case built around multiple types of evidence. The jury heard about Paul Onion's escape. They heard about the items recovered during police searches. They heard about firearms and forensic evidence. They heard how victims' disappearances connected to the discoveries at Belanglo. The prosecution argued that these were not separate crimes. They were the work of one offender, one method, one pattern. The defence challenged the evidence and argued that the prosecution's case did not prove Milat was responsible. But after weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. On the 27th of July 1996, Ivan Milat was found guilty of murdering 7 backpackers. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences. 7 young lives had been taken. 7 families had been left with unanswered questions. And Australia had learned the identity of the man behind one of the most notorious criminal cases. But one question remained. Was the true number of victims higher? Because before Ivan Milat became known as Australia's backpacker killer, there were years of unexplained disappearances. The official number of victims is 7. Deborah Everist, James Gibson, Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, Anja Habschied, Joanne Walters, Caroline Clarke. They were travellers, backpackers. They were sons and daughters, friends, loved ones, people with futures ahead of them. Their stories were not supposed to end in a forest. Their families were supposed to receive more phone calls, more letters, more memories. Instead, they were left searching for answers. The investigation into Ivan Milat revealed one of Australia's most shocking crimes. But the Belanglo murders left behind questions that continued decades later. How many victims were there? Were there other people who never made it home? And how did someone responsible for such crimes remain undetected for so long? In part 2, we examine the evidence, the trial, the courtroom battle, and the case that finally brought Ivan Milat to justice. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.